Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 35 years of law enforcement analysis experience. He is one of the first to develop a crime analysis unit and a crime analysis program. He's one of the founding members of the Colorado Crime Analysis Association and the IACA. He's also the founder of Corona Solutions, a patrol deployment, scheduling, and redistricting software. And now he's enjoying retirement in the great state of Colorado. Please welcome Dale Harris. Dale, how are we doing?
Doing great, Jason.
Oh, thank you so much. How's retirement treating you?
I'm loving it.
Very good. Didn't have to worry about the COVID pandemic. You're just going to chill out at home anyway, right?
Yeah, it's pretty easy to stay isolated this way. But I do feel for people that have to work and school and such.
Oh, definitely. All right. So there is a lot that I want to cover in this interview. The first thing I want to do is just go back in time, 1980, and you are part of a team that starts to develop a crime analysis unit, which is pretty early in the days of crime analysis. So can you just talk about how this came to be, how you became part of this development process?
Sure. I was a detective in 1980. My department, Arvada, Colorado, had decided to start a crime analysis unit based on this DOJ program. None of us really knew exactly what crime analysis was, but DOJ did put out a book that covered the high points, at least. So the department decided to do it. It was a sworn position. I applied and one other officer applied, and I happened to be chosen. It was not a very popular choice. Some people said, "Oh, you're just going to be a statistician and juggle numbers all day." I said, I hope that's not what it is. But I really like the idea of being more proactive in discovering patterns and counteracting those patterns. So that's what got me into it. And it was a unit of one, so I could hardly call it a team. But actually, that is one of the reasons that we started the Colorado Association. After about, 6 months or so, I read the books and I doing some of the work, but I'm thinking other people have to know more about this than I do. So that's when I reached out to other agencies in Colorado, invited them to a meeting just to talk about this. And I was fortunate, we got about 20 or 25 attendees that first meeting. So we started meeting monthly, and then we formed the organization just to make things a little more business-like, I guess.
Yeah, I want to get to the Colorado Association development. Just a couple of follow-up questions on the beginning here, because DOJ, it was part of the ICAP program. Do you remember what ICAP stands for?
Yeah, the Integrated Criminal Apprehension Program.
As you can see it, is that really where this concept of crime analysis came from, was this program with the DOJ?
Well, before it expanded. Mm-hmm. But even back in the 1950s in Chicago, I think it was Wilson who started talking about analyzing crime patterns. I'm not sure if they used the term crime analysis, but that was really where it started.
And so in the DOJ book, you told me that they were suggesting that you do it without a computer.
Oh, they were very adamant about that.
Take us through that concept.
Sure. Well, think again, back in the late 70s, 1980, the computers were just mainframes, and not every agency even had a mainframe. Mm-hmm. But getting any program done was, in our department, our city, we had two software developers, and they were backlogged for years on projects like payroll and cities, streets, and things like that. So getting any programming done was difficult to expect. So I think the people at ICAP thought we'd be wasting all our time getting programming done and not doing a good job of it rather than analyzing crime and setting up systems. I think their thinking at that point was a good manual system will evolve into a computerized system at some point.
So how were they expecting to keep track of all the data and to analyze it?
Well, the matrix was the big thing. And now this is before spreadsheets, of course, but they wanted everybody to have a matrix with a row for each incident and a column for each characteristic, like MO, date and time of occurrence, location, and such. So with these matrices, and theoretically, you could scan through what you've collected and discover patterns. As you can imagine, that was not very easy to do, but that's what we had to work with. And of course, we had pin maps with actual pins.
Yes. I'm thinking back, and I had Mitri Lewis on from here in Florida months ago, and she talked about having different sheets, poster-sized sheets of maps that hung up, and just being able to move those physically out of the way and doing pin maps and dealing with string and all that other stuff. So is that the same thing that you're dealing with as well at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. We had the yarn to try to identify geographic patterns. And then a year or two later, I got acetate overlay, which was major innovation. So I could put adhesive dots on the map instead of pins, which of course destroy the paper. But
I gotcha.
This is pretty primitive days.
Yeah. So what are some products that you're putting together at this time?
Well, one of the products that I was required to do was a daily list of our target crimes: burglary, robbery, sex crimes, and also auto burglaries. So every day I'd have typed up a list and, date, time, location, a couple of lines describing it. Hung that around the department on clipboards, but I was pretty sure nobody was reading these things, and I sure didn't like making them because I thought, this is not analysis, this is just clerical work. So one day I made a fake entry into my list, and I said, yesterday a UFO landed in the back parking lot and absconded with Lieutenant Scott, and he's not been seen since. So I put that out, and I waited 2 or 3 days, and nobody said anything. So finally I went to my boss, who was a lieutenant. I said, you're reading these things? And, oh yeah, these are really valuable. Well, let me keep doing it. And I said, well, did you read the one from last Wednesday about the UFO? He said, oh, I must have missed that one. Then he read it. And then he realized the jig was up, that nobody was reading these things. So that was my last day of doing that list.
So that's fantastic. I always think of when it comes to stuff like that, Steve Gottlieb, what he used to do is put them on different colored paper, whatever he handed it out, so he could look in the garbage can later to easily identify what just goes into the trash and doesn't get kept.
Yeah, that same thing.
Yeah.
Steve and I came along about the same time, I think. So
yeah,
we had similar experiences.
How did the rest of the department react to this?
Well, as you know, police departments love change. But we got some ideas from various agencies in the Colorado Association. What really paid off, I think, was a weekly newsletter I put out. I called it the Crime Fighter News. And I still listed some of the crimes, but I tried to add a little more narrative to it and maybe a little lighthearted things. I did a couple of quizzes, and I said, so if you have this activity, this MO, what's the crime that's occurred here? And I said, you'll win a fabulous prize if you're the first one to get the answer. Fabulous prize turned out to be a cup of coffee or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, I was trying to keep the people and keep them reading it, because rather than just ignoring the lists, they actually looked forward to those weekly newsletters. And another very important thing was, when it's a good thing, mention the officer's name.
I gotcha.
That really builds the readership.
Interesting. Yes, we are name droppers here on the podcast, so we've kind of taken that advice from you already. So even though the DOJ book suggested that you don't use a computer, you said the hell with that and started developing a crime analysis program.
Well, one of our 2 programmers I was pretty friendly with, and he got interested in developing this thing. So we worked together, and the main thing that I wanted to be able to do with the computer was queries. The computers in those days were great at collecting information, but they were terrible at giving it back. So if you wanted to query, you basically had to write COBOL code. I don't know if anybody knows what COBOL is anymore.
They'll have to Google it.
Common business-oriented language. But that was what our computer ran with. But give me a list of people arrested for second-degree burglary in the last 6 months. You couldn't do it. It might have been in the system, but you weren't able to discover it. So that was the first thing, just be able to query the silly system. But then later on, we kind of hacked a little mapping program together on the mainframe, which was, I mean, you'd laugh if you saw it now. It actually did display the city and it showed numbers of incidents by various geocodes or RDs, I guess was the most common.
Was it street level data, or did you just have boundaries and just do counts per boundary, assigned to a boundary?
Yeah, we had like maybe 200 RDs in the city, and it would display all 200 imitating a map. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really a map, it was just numbers. But each cell on the screen recommended one of the RDs.
I gotcha.
But then once we got that and finally got PCs, then I could download that data and do more sophisticated mapping and analysis. But that was 2 or 3 years later.
Yeah. Now, are you doing the data entry at this time too, or are there other folks that are doing the data entry at this time?
A combination, I would say.
Okay.
They didn't really want non-technical people and non-clerks doing data entry because I think they didn't trust us.
Okay.
But eventually I persuaded them that, yeah, we really need somebody to actually read the report, figure out what the characteristics of the crime are, and enter them in the system. So it took a while.
So when does the unit grow to more than just one person?
It's quite a while. Gosh, it must have been around 1990.
Okay.
We wrote a grant for another analyst. I was experimenting with artificial neural networks, which, as you probably know, takes a lot of data and a lot of work to set up. And I just didn't have time to do all that. So we got this grant. And that's where Judy Kimmenaugh came to work with me. So we worked together for 5 or 6 years at least. But that was still 2 people. Actually, the department still has 2 people after 40 years.
Now, did you always find yourself to be more technically minded?
Yeah, and it's just a matter of survival. I need this data. I need this analysis. And there's nobody else can do it for me. So just have to figure out how to do it myself.
It's interesting. Just a total pioneer. I remember when I started in the early 2000s and not knowing anything about the mapping software, not knowing anything about records management systems or CAD. Certainly had mentors, people that did know all that stuff that I could lean on and learn from. But man, it just seems like you just out there on your own trying to figure this out. You just have a blank slate in front of you.
That's pretty much it, yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, that's why we started the associations to share methods and data, mainly methods.
Okay, well, let's get into that a little bit with this idea of developing the associations. Because as you mentioned, you said that, hey, I know I'm not the only one. There's got to be somebody else that has done this. I'm not going to recreate the wheel. Let's reach out. I find that concept interesting because to me, it seems natural to do. But when I talk to either different disciplines outside of law enforcement or even analysis from other countries, there seems to be a hesitancy definitely about people not reaching out and trying to learn from one another. Why do you think crime analysis was so successful in being so open to reaching out and developing these associations and data sharing?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm guessing because we didn't have any history that we needed to overcome. It's not like, well, we've been doing it this way for 40 years, so why change now? But nobody had done it. So.
Yeah, and I think intel analysis has that issue. I don't want to call it an issue. It has that phenomena. Intelligence has been around thousands of years. I think the intelligence analysis profession has that where it's not new, and crime analysis is new. So I think that's a valid point you have.
Well, that's my best guess, at least.
We'll take it.
Okay.
So then how many people did you say you got at this first meeting in Colorado?
It was about 20, 25 people,
And
mainly sworn clerks.
just interesting. Do you remember what the agenda was for the first couple of meetings?
I think we, I don't even want to call it an agenda. We just got acquainted and we talked a little bit about crime analysis and possible avenues to pursue. Among the topics at that time, there was a statewide computer system, which wasn't much better than our local. But we thought perhaps as a group, we could influence the state system to develop processes that were more to our needs. That never really worked out, but that was part of the goal.
I'm impressed that there was 20 people that showed up. That seems high to me. Does that seem high to you from your vantage point?
Well, I think one thing that influenced it is that, of course, we didn't have internet in those days or email. It was actually my chief who sent a letter to the other chiefs, and then they passed it down their chain, I guess. So, you get a memo from the chief says, hey, check this out. You're a little more likely to do that than if you just get an email that invites you to a meeting.
So were other people also creating programs on their mainframe, or were they shocked that you were developing this?
Well, I think, I'd be bragging if I said I was the only one doing it. But
That's okay. That's okay to be pompous. No worries.
There were people developing methods and practices. So I don't want to glorify myself too much here. But actually, computerizing processes was just not available to anybody.
So what year did the Colorado Association officially establish?
1981.
Wow. How often are you meeting back in 1981?
Monthly.
Where were some of the jurisdictions for those folks that may know Colorado?
Yeah, mainly Denver Metro.
Okay.
Colorado Springs was a leader in crime analysis. They had a different grant that helped them get started. But the suburban agencies around Denver, Lakewood, Arvada, where I worked, Westminster, Thornton, Aurora was always a leader also.
Now, during this time in these areas, is crime considered historically bad?
Well, that's kind of a general term, I guess. Our biggest issue in those days was our residential burglary. I mean, our city had 100,000 population, and we were running about 1,200 burglaries per year. If I could tell you a little anecdote about that, it might help.
Sure.
Actually, in the crime analysis, one part of the reason for inviting these other agencies is we know the crooks didn't care about city boundaries. If they're breaking into my citizens' houses, what are they doing in the next city? When I first started Crime Analysis Unit, I was looking at the reports, and at that time, the price of gold had really shot up from, $200 an ounce up to $600. So the burglars, of course, thought, hey, let's steal some gold and sell it. And there weren't any controls on buying gold in Colorado in those days. So these guys could just walk into a pawn shop, or there was a little kiosk at the mall. They could, my grandmother died again and left me all this jewelry. So everybody was happy except the victims. But that really got the residential burglary problem going. So I told my boss about this pattern I was seeing, and I knew exactly when they were hitting and how they were hitting and all that. And my boss said, great, this is exactly why we started a crime analysis unit. And just as soon as we got our patrol fully staffed, we're going to attack this problem. Of course, I immediately knew we're never going to get patrol fully staffed, just because it takes a year to replace an officer that leaves. So that's just the nature of things. So I suggested to the boss, let's look at the schedule and see if we can put some people where we need them at the times the crimes are occurring. He challenged me and said, you come up with a better schedule, we'll implement it and we'll go from there. So that's what I did for the next 20 years or so.
So is that concept of directed patrols?
Yeah, it hadn't been invented yet, but that was the idea.
Okay. So then was this successful? Yeah, I mean, did you catch burglars in the act and reduce the burglary issues in the area?
Well, yes, of course, not like any operation. It doesn't work as well as you'd like it to.
Sure.
But we were able to put enough officers out there in those neighborhoods and have some impact.
With these directed patrols, even though that's a concept not invented yet at the time, I mean, how did the other officers react? You're saying, hey, here's the problem, explaining why you think it's going to happen at this time in this location. What was the reaction at this time from the other officers?
For a few, it was great. When they weren't on calls, they would go out there and be in the right place at the right time sometimes. But they saw the value of that because they were tired of just taking reports and never catching anybody. And, other officers, when I get a call, I'll handle it. Leave me alone the rest of the time.
I got you.
Probably like most departments.
When it comes to the Colorado Crime Analysis Association, what are you most proud of with that association?
Well, I think it led to a lot of professional development among the analysts. Well, here's a school we could go to, or maybe one person goes to the school and comes back and shares what they learned at that school. Or, somebody's experimenting with a new software program or a procedure that seems to work for them. So just sharing the information and developing analysts. There was a lot of analysts who, and no disrespect to records clerks, but because it involved a computer, it must be a clerk's job in those days. Mm-hmm. We had officers that would refuse to touch a keyboard at all.
That seems such a foreign concept today to me.
Well, it was a challenge, but yeah, if we could bring people up, and actually another thing we probably helped with, they did a salary survey every year, and some people were making peanuts and other people's were pretty well paid. So it gave them a little bargaining position for salary increases.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to get into how we go from the Colorado Crime Analysis Association to the International Association of Crime Analysts. And also then you're developing your company, Corona Solutions. You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Sally Rawlings, and I'm curious if other people have the same experience. You get on an airplane to travel somewhere, and the person sitting next to you says, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And you say crime analysis, and they go, "Oh, I love CSI. I watch all the shows. I almost did it, but then I didn't." So then you debate, do I correct him or do I just roll with it? I've gotten to the point now I go, yeah, CSI is awesome.
Hi everyone, my name is Mindy and I am a writer for Analyst Talk with Jason Elder as well as a current crime analyst. My PSA for our listeners is don't compare your origin stories to others. I used to be super insecure when asked, why do you want to be an analyst or in law enforcement? And I always felt like I had imposter syndrome because I didn't have a good reason. I don't have any family members in law enforcement. I've never been involved in a crime, knock on wood. And I just felt like I had no good reason for being here besides just being interested in the industry. 6 years later, I still don't feel like I have a good answer, but I love my job and I'm pretty good at it. Passion or your calling isn't something that just hits you one day. It is something that's built and maintained over time, day by day, every day. If you're on the fence whether you're cut out for this field, just go for it. If you currently have no reason, make a reason. Make your own origin story. I believe in you.
Welcome back. Before the break, Dale was telling us about him starting a crime analysis unit and the Colorado Crime Analysis Association. Dale, I want to go from 1981, developing the Colorado Crime Analysis Association, to 1990, when the International Association of Crime Analysts is developed. You're, of course, one of the founding fathers of both associations. So from your perspective, just kind of tell the story of how the IACA got developed.
Sure. The Colorado Association, in our monthly meetings, this always came up, but who else in other states is doing something good in crime analysis? And we hear things just through the grapevine, but nothing regular. Eventually, and I don't remember exactly how we found out about Mark Stallo and that group. And I know Mark has already appeared, so he's covered that. But they, again, this is all pre-internet, pre-emails. So they had put out word that they would like to get together and explore an association. And of course, that's exactly what we've been trying to do in Colorado. So we hooked up with them, and one of the people in his group was from Kansas City, and he was willing to host that organizational meeting. So,
And who was that from Kansas City?
I wish I could remember his name, but that was the only time I ever was aware of him. So
Okay.
I don't think he stayed in the profession, but
Okay.
he did arrange the hotel and get us the chance to meet. And actually, there was a gentleman there from Canada in our first meeting, which I thought was really helpful also, just to expand our scope. And I don't remember exactly how many were there. It might have been around 20. So anyway, we all went to Kansas City and we talked about what crime analysis really is and where we'd like to go with it, and decided that it was appropriate to start an organization. So that first meeting, I think it was 2 days, we developed some bylaws and organizational structure and decided to proceed with that. But then after that meeting, the gentleman who had been elected president at the meeting had some professional changes and he was unable to participate anymore. So
That's Stephen Rothstein.
yeah. So because Colorado already had an association, we were a little better able to organize a conference. So we hosted that first conference in the summer of 1991. And that's where I was elected president to replace Stephen. So I did that for the next 3 years.
So that seems like a pretty quick turnaround to me. So 1990, various groups of crime analysts come together, have a meeting to establish the IACA, and then a year later, you're throwing on the first conference.
Well, actually, a little less than a year, actually, but I guess it was kind of quick. We were anxious to get going and start benefiting from other people's knowledge. In that first conference, I think we had 55 people, something like that.
Okay, that was my next question. How many people were there? And do you remember how wide-ranging it was in terms of attendees, like where people were from?
A few from California. I know Wendy Harn from LASO was there. She's really helped us out a lot in knowing how things work. I'd be guessing. Maybe we had 20 states represented, maybe less.
Just give a description of what the first conference looked like. Is it still the same concept of setting up different tracks of different topics and speakers? Compare and contrast if somebody would go back in time, what they know the IACA conference is today versus back in 1991, the first conference.
Well, it was a single track conference. But in those days, it's probably changed quite a bit by now, but a lot of the analysts really didn't know much about statistical analysis. So I gave a class on, I called it 90% of everything you need to know about statistics. And just covering the basics, because a lot of people didn't know different measures of average and confidence intervals. That was linear regression analysis. Most of our analysts in those days just did not know those concepts. So I gave that class. Other people gave classes. David Rogers from Longmont, Colorado, gave a class on crime reporting. He was developing a software program for, I forget the terminology, but in which case you'd more likely capture all of the information. Our crime report forms in those days were, you might have room for 2 victims on your sheet. If you had a third victim, they probably just disappeared. So that was not very productive. So crime reporting was important. Mark, I believe, was getting into computerized crime mapping at that time. Mark Stallo with Map Info, which of course I was immensely jealous of because I didn't have it. But that's kind of where we were with it.
Is that the same conference where Noah Fritz spoke as well?
Yes, I should have mentioned that sooner. Actually, one of our speakers didn't show up. I met Noah at lunch on the first day, and I said, hey, because I'd heard Noah talk about various things, and I knew he knew what he was talking about, which was very refreshing. So I asked Noah, I said, hey, would you mind filling in for a session tomorrow afternoon? He hesitated a bit. And then he said, sure, I'll do it.
Yeah, I just had him on the show last week and he talked about that. And I think he might have even said it was the last session, but maybe my memory's not as good from last week. I shouldn't complain. I should be able to remember that from last week. But he did talk about that concept. It's like, hey, there was not that many people there. And I just went up and spoke, talked about my struggles with trying to develop crime analysis.
Yeah. Yeah. Noah really helped us out that time. Well, and other times too, but
Sure.
it's kind of a lifesaver.
So I guess besides the conference, then, what were the priorities as president, the second president of the IACA?
A newsletter was pretty high on our list just so we could have better communication among analysts. And of course, building the membership, because we were pretty sure there were a lot of analysts out there that we hadn't contacted yet.
So is that just a matter of sending the newsletter out to different police departments, kind of similar to what you talked about before, where you contact the different police chiefs and mail out a flyer advertising this new association?
I can't actually remember if we mailed out a flyer or not. Okay. The newsletter, which was very difficult to get put together and distributed just because people don't like to write articles for newsletters, I guess. But we figured that was our best bet to spread the knowledge and gain membership.
At this time, the dues are exactly the same as they are today, which is $25 a year, correct?
Yes.
Most of that sounds like it's either going into the budget or going into the newsletter, right?
I think whoever published the newsletter was able to get postage from their own departments.
Wow.
We were kind of beggars in those days. We didn't really have any money.
What are you most proud of during your presidency with the IACA?
Well, it's just bringing people together and sharing the knowledge. It still is very satisfying to me that people who were interested in the subject had a way to learn more about it and tell other people what they've learned. And so the whole profession, I think, was aided, at least I hoped it was. In those days, I think it may have changed a bit now, but we welcomed academics and private sector. If they had something to contribute or interest in the field, and we welcomed them in. Yeah. Well, and I know Mark mentioned Greg Jackson, who was from Georgia Light, right? Yeah, Georgia Light and Power. So he was private sector, and of course he had a different, broader view because he's a statewide company, I suppose.
Yeah. Do you know how he got involved with this?
I think he might have been in that original group that had a class. I think the class may have been in Florida that Mark Stallo went to along with some others.
But you don't know how he got mixed in with coming from the electric company to be a part of this crime analysis association development.
Well, his duties with the electric company involved crime and, well, just crime, I guess.
Oh, okay. I'll have to get him on the show if I can.
I haven't heard from him in 15 years, I guess.
Yeah, so. I gotcha. Get his perspective. That'd be interesting. As you think back from this time to now, what are some things that the IACA's done that is really, maybe, I don't know if shock's a good word, but just kind of like, oh, I never thought from 1990 when we had that first meeting till then that IACA would do something like that?
Well, Jason, I'd have to say that we developed this vision in 1990, and the association is doing exactly what we had in mind. I mean, in the general sense, I'm joking here a little bit. we had no idea how that technology would develop, but it was always about sharing information and developing better methods of analysis.
Yeah, because it's just interesting. Mark talked about the reason why IACA's website is IACA.net, because he was the only one available and he wanted IACA. So
that's right.
That's the only one that was left at the time in 1994, I think he said.
Yeah, Mark and I went back and forth on that because we both wanted to be ICA, and of course we didn't want .com. And I called whoever was handing out URLs in those days, and I asked for .gov, and they said, "Oh no, you can't have .gov. That's reserved for federal government." So that's how we came up with .net.
But you settled on IACA. Was there any other names for the association that were considered other than IACA?
None that I recall. I think we did that in the very first meeting.
What else was talked about at the first meeting other than the conference, the newsletter, and the name?
Well, I think all of the attendees talked about what they were working on as far as developing their units and their systems. So that was useful. And you mentioned certification, and that was something I worked on the whole time I was involved in IACA. That was a challenge.
Yeah,
A
it
lot of
still
people,
is.
okay. A lot of people recognized it would be helpful,
Mhm.
and we tried to market it on, you get certified, you're a lot more likely to get that new job as a crime analyst, and maybe some financial implications. But God, we worked on that for years. And finally, I was at our monthly Colorado meeting. I asked the group if we could just go around the room and everybody suggest a skill that a certified crime analyst should have. So we went around the room and I think we came up with 21 different skills, like using a spreadsheet, computer mapping, etc. And then sent those off to the rest of the board in IACA. And I believe that set was actually used in the early days of certification.
Now, I know that it's probably how the book came about too, because I know there was 20 chapters in the book. The certification exam has 20 questions. Has 20 sections I think there's 200 questions on the exam. So 10 questions per section. That's probably how that all came to be.
Well, it was a rough draft anyway, because we just couldn't get any action. That people would say, yeah, it's a good idea. Somebody ought to do that. But nobody actually did it.
So I also had Christopher Bruce on the program as well. And I asked him this question, and I want to ask it to you because just to get your take on it. I asked him what has surprised you about thinking that crime analysis as a profession would be farther along in this topic. And he said statistics. He said that he is really surprised when he first started getting into analysis, working with police departments. He thought by the year 2020 that statistics at police departments would be more accepted, more used, more sophisticated.
I can sympathize with that assessment from Chris. I just had lunch with my ex-chief a while back, and I told him the very last project I worked on in 1998 before I retired was a way to forecast date, time, and location for auto burglaries. We had a pattern going on in the northern part of the city, your basic 4 a.m. most likely break-ins or taking, CDs or DVDs in those days. So I did this whole thing. I said, okay, in this hour between 1 and 2, your most likely target is in this 1 or 2 block area. And then the next hour, it moves a little bit, it's in this area. So I put that out, and the sergeant said, oh, great, we're going to catch these guys now. So the next morning, I talked to the sergeant, and I asked, well, how'd it go? Did you make any luck? And did you work that neighborhood? He said, nah, we were too busy on calls. So, which was kind of the story of my life. We're too busy on calls. We can't fight crime. It's eternal frustration.
Yeah, it's also interesting. Steve Gottlieb warned about using the word prediction, because even if they would have gone out there and then didn't catch anybody, did they scare them off? Did you prevent the crime? You never really know unless eventually you catch the suspect. He or she tells you and says, yeah, I saw you that night. I was going to break in or commit a crime, but I didn't because I saw you guys on surveillance.
It's always a challenge. It wasn't our city. It was Fort Collins, where they had a series of cat burglaries. For some reason, it's a college town. You'd think people would know enough to lock their doors, but they don't. So this guy was going into occupied houses and stealing stuff. The analyst in Fort Collins in those days was Judy Kimanow, who's a good friend of mine. So we worked together on this a little bit, and we came up, they're hitting on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I believe, about 4 o'clock in this neighborhood. It was a pretty tight neighborhood. So she developed that whole analysis and put it out to her detectives. And they kind of said, yeah, well, we're real detectives and you're just a civilian, so we'll do it our way. And she said, he's going to hit Tuesday night, 4 o'clock in the morning in this neighborhood. And they said, yeah. Well, we'd rather work Wednesday nights or something. I don't know.
That's bowling night. Can't do that.
Yeah, whatever. But they actually did hit exactly where and when she forecasted. So they came back to Judy and said, hey, you were right. Do that again. If I'd been Judy, I think I would have been tempted to slap him. But she actually did it again. And she said, okay, he's going to hit this Thursday night in this area, in this MO. And then they caught him that time. That's nice. Great.
Well, let's take another break. When we come back, I want to talk about you retiring because you've developed a company, Corona Solutions. And then I also want to talk a little bit about your advice to current analysts. You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi everyone, it's Yarisa Walsh. So today I want to leave you with a quick advice. When you send out something to either your investigators or your team, please ensure that you format. One of my biggest pet peeves and things that I have noticed is when analysts actually send out a lot of their work, whether it's PDF or words or any briefing, and the work is not properly formatted. So I will give you that advice and leave you with that to think about.
Hey there, everybody. This is Albert Mesa, and I'm here to ask you a very important question. Have you ever done a sit-along with the dispatcher? If the answer is no, and you're currently an analyst, you're missing out on a huge piece of the data puzzle. Not only will you open your eyes to how data is captured, entered, and coded, you'll see how calls are prioritized and dispatched and get a true feel for CAD data. You'll get to see it in a whole new light and use it as a tool in your analysis. And who doesn't want to sit with a true first responder who probably saved a life right before they sat with you?
Welcome back. Dale, thank you for your time again. I want to move on now. So you eventually develop and you're the founder of Corona Solutions, which leads to your retirement and taking that on full time. Talk about how that got started and how you ended up being so successful with the company.
Sure. Well, it all goes back to that conversation I talked about with my boss and him challenging me to develop a better schedule. So following on to that, I developed the patrol schedules for the department for years. But I'd heard about software that would do a better job of that. Again, the DOJ had a grant program where they worked at it, but it was very cumbersome. They had a program that was written in Fortran, which was foreign to most people. And I never could get a copy of it anyway. I said, I don't know it exists. But I was in grad school at the time, and I was studying queuing theory. It dawned on me, this is a perfect application for patrol scheduling, a multi-channel queuing model. So I knew software needed to be written, and I knew I was not qualified to do it. So my son, fortunately, was qualified. And he was working as a programmer for a different company at the time. But he agreed to help me out. So for about 6 months, we programmed this queuing model, which would allow the agency to say, well, I want a 6-minute priority 1 response time. And I have this workload in this geography. How many people do I need on duty? And that's basically what it still is. We're still trying to optimize patrol staffing. So I did that for my department for several years. And those nights and weekends, we were developing the program more. Then we decided to market it. So it actually caught on pretty well. And then we got so many customers so quickly that I just couldn't do both jobs. So I retired and went to work full time for Corona. So there's clients all over the US and England. We had a client there and still have 2 or 3 in Canada. It's a little tougher in Canada because they can't release their data out of the country, which seems unwise. I mean, it's just numbers. We're not doing personal information or anything, but rules are rules. So that was the challenge with the Canadians.
So why do you think the company took off so quickly?
Well, everybody had the same problem. First of all, they were trying to make the best use of whatever resources they had, and they were trying to get more resources. And to justify those more resources, they often had to prove that they were doing the best they could with what they had, and it was still insufficient. And our program helped them show that there's an agency in the state of Washington, I remember, that they had just a terrible schedule and insufficient staffing. So they got the system, and I went up there to do the training. The county government sent one of their own people to the training just to make sure we weren't pulling any shenanigans, I think. I'll paraphrase what she said. As we were going through the data, she suddenly said, holy crap, you really do need more people. So that kind of solidified that contract.
Yeah. Do you know how many people they hired based on that class?
My best recollection is 17 more deputies.
Wow.
And the best part is they were able to show that with those added deputies, they were able to meet their performance standards.
What are some concepts around deployment and scheduling? I know in, for instance, the hotel industry or the airline industry, a big part of their modeling is based on the number of seats or the number of hotel rooms that go unfilled.
Well, in the early days, they were just counting calls. Oh, you got 150 calls. You need so many cops on duty for this day. And they were just doing it at the shift level, which was very inadequate. So the concept is we started measuring how much time the call took and how many units, how many officers were required. Believe it or not, people had not been doing that prior. They just said a call is a call. And then a few of them would go by priority. Oh, priority one calls are more important, so we'll give them more weight, which is not necessarily true. So just getting a handle on the demand for service, the demand profile is the term we used. But then looking at schedules, and I've often said there are at least as many different schedules as there are police departments. Because everybody has their own idea how things should be run.
Sure.
And in those days, I don't see it so much anymore. A lot of rotating schedules. You work a week of days and a week of nights and weekends on, weekends off. Trying to be fair, but when you do that, you end up with inefficient deployment. You got, well, in Canada, this is very popular in Canada, is the 10-hour or the 12-hour shift. 2 days, 2 nights, and 4 off. So you have exactly the same number of officers on duty all the time, which was obviously grossly inefficient. So if you were on when they didn't need that many, you're in the feather bed. But then if you come around to when they really need more people, they're just not there. Plus, going from days to nights every week was extremely unhealthy. I always argue against that. Once I could show people the benefits of a fixed shift system, they would usually adopt it.
I'm thinking right now as you're describing this, I talked to one sergeant the one time who was dealing with deployment, and he was coming up with a way of scheduling so folks could have like every Friday and Saturday off, or they could have every other Friday or Saturday off. So it had nothing to do with the data, had nothing to do with deployment. The whole goal was to have certain days of the week off, which I'm sure that you've experienced over the years.
Oh, absolutely. Even though we've had some success, there's still a lot of agencies that have these crazy schedules.
So where did the name Corona Solutions come from?
Oh, my son and I just dreamed it up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now, on our website, I think it still says that is named after Corona Pass, which is a pass in the mountains west of Denver, which no particular relationship to police work or anything else. It's just a place I like to go. And so I was thinking Corona in the same conversation. My son said, I was thinking maybe Crown. So, well, that's prophetic because Crown and Corona are the same thing. So we selected Corona, but that's it.
I wonder how many folks this year have made it to your website thinking that it's a vaccine for the virus.
Oh, gosh. I talked to my son when this first came out, and I said, that's really unfortunate that they used Corona to describe this virus. But
yeah, I was thinking, man, if I worked for Corona Beer, I think I would sue somebody. Like, well, what are you trying to do to our business model here?
This is just a little aside. We went to our first IACA conference, IACP conference, and we were going around talking to other vendors and such, and we had our name tags, and these guys kept saying, oh, Corona, we like your beer. and I'm thinking, we didn't even think about Corona beer. I'm not a beer drinker, so it just escaped me. Or Corona cigars or typewriters.
That's funny. The company expands into more than just scheduling, right? So you get into solving other issues with the police department.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we did when we signed Seattle, they wanted a redistricting application, which we had not yet developed. But we probably overly optimistically promised it. But I'd been thinking, well, I'd been doing it for my agency for some time, I didn't really have an application. I was using cluster analysis and some other tools, but I had an idea how it could be done. So we went back to the shop and wrote what you called a geobalance to redistrict based on the agency's workload and their own priorities. And that worked really well. That really surprised a lot of people how much better they could do if they rearranged their district boundaries or beat boundaries.
How often is that done?
Generally once a year.
Really? I was just thinking, I don't remember any police department that I worked for that changed their district boundaries.
Well, shame on them.
Yeah.
I mean, cities change and you get new developments and new highways and other things that make them unbalanced.
Yeah. Oh, I do remember one. It was in Baltimore. It was the Eastern District, and the guy that became the major, his church was not in his district, so he wanted his church in there, and that's why they changed it. I think that's the only time that I've heard someone say, let's change a district boundary.
Well, I'll tell you a story on a similar theme. I was working with an agency in Oklahoma, and they wanted to redistrict. It was a fairly large agency. I won't name the name. But so they involved their district captains in the program, and they were using our program, and then the captains were helping draw the boundary lines. And, the captain from District 1 said, well, I don't want this neighborhood in my district because too much crime or whatever. Oh, this is too boring. We need to bring in more crime or something. So they came up with a district plan, which is really not very good. It was more on the captain's political preferences. Mm-hmm. From then on, when I trained somebody on it, I said, don't tell them which district they're going to have when this is over. Assign the districts to the captains after this is done, because then they won't know which one they're going to get and they can't tweak it to their own preferences. It's not a simple thing, but just humans will mess anything up.
Yeah, that's for sure. So you eventually develop an innovation award, or Corona Solutions had a innovation award that was given out at the IACA conference every year. And so just kind of go over what that innovation award was and what you were hoping to get out of that award.
Well, I'd been going to all these conferences, the IACA conferences, and talked to a lot of people. And some people had some really good ideas and had developed some really good systems, but they weren't telling other people about it. Maybe a private conversation.
We're horrible at marketing. As law enforcement analysts are horrible at marketing, but go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Well, and we were trying to assist with that problem. So I decided that I know people have some really good ideas in this organization. So we should recognize those ideas and give an award. Like you said, we're terrible at marketing. But I was thinking, well, if we can some incentive to share, then we'd be more likely to get results. And that was what it was all about. It was just to encourage people to share their successful practices. As I told people, I wanted to give a cash prize like the Nobel Prize or something. And at that time, the board did not think that was a good idea. So we just did the scholarship, paid their hotel and transportation. And
to the conference.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, was there one award winner that sticks out to you, and what did he or she do?
Well, I can't describe the details to you very well because it's been so long, but Jim Mallard, who was then with Arlington, Texas, he won one year, and he developed some integrated systems using Microsoft Office software, but he did it in such a way that was really sophisticated, I thought, and anybody could have adopted his methods, which is another thing that we don't want, silos where nobody can copy this. We want to share. So he did a really good presentation, had a good program. I was retired by then, so I didn't have the opportunity to implement any of it, but Jim did a really good job on that.
Yeah, especially for smaller departments, tight budgets, most are going to have Microsoft Office, Excel access. So the ability to use something that's automated using those, I could see to being very helpful.
Yeah, I think it was.
So what advice do you have for analysts? And it doesn't have to be to new analysts. It can be to experienced analysts.
I guess the most important thing is to share your results. It doesn't do any good to develop this big analytical product and say, oh, it's these crimes are up or down or this way or MO or whatever, and then not tell anybody. It might give you a warm feeling to know that you did it, but you're not doing any good. So, and if you're wrong, let them tell you you're wrong and improve it next time.
My kids do that to me. They'll tell me, I knew it. And I was like, well, why didn't you tell me beforehand? You're like, oh, well, no, they didn't really know it. Hindsight's 20/20, right?
That's right. Well, and I was talking to a prospective customer of one time. He called me, he was a Canadian customer, as a matter of fact. He said, well, I think we need your software to help us improve our schedule. And what you can tell me about it? And I said, well, you want to look at shift length? And he said, no, we can't change shift length. Okay, how about start times? No, can't change that. And we went through everything possible. And the answer was, no, we can't change it. So after that call, I developed this little sentence that I've used ever since. It is impossible to improve what you will not change.
Nice.
Now, improvement is not guaranteed, but if you don't change anything, nothing's going to improve.
I want to finish up with some personal interests of yours, because I find it fascinating that you got your pilot's license. At what age did you get your pilot's license?
I think I was 39.
Wow. That seems old to me. I don't, no offense. I just I was thinking somebody that gets their pilot license, that's something that they do younger than that. As you're getting this, you're talking to other people, is 39 pretty old to get a pilot's license?
Not especially. I mean,
okay.
At least in my case, I had a young family and small budgets, and doing something as expensive as flying was not available to me. So that was when I was able to do it.
I got you. I guess, was it just something you always wanted to do, or how did you get interested in wanting to fly?
Well, my family were farmers, and my dad had been a World War II pilot, and we had a Piper Cub that we flew off a pasture on the farm. So I never got licensed, but I spent a lot of time in that little airplane. So.
Okay. Kind of grew up around airplanes, little either twin engine style planes.
All single engine. I never did multi.
Okay. Any stories from that? Anything that sticks out, your time flying?
Well, I guess the main thing is I got my license and I could fly around a little bit. I flew on a few business trips for Corona. Actually, I flew a couple of analysts to Kansas City for that organizational meeting in 1990. But then I just wanted to do something useful. So I joined Civil Air Patrol, and we did search and rescue missions over the mountains. I did that for about 8 or 10 years. Kind of dangerous, but still a lot of fun.
And that's an airplane. Obviously, somebody's missing, and you're flying around trying to look for evidence of the missing person.
Yeah. I once offered to map all our crash locations for the state. And the guy I mentioned it to, he said, well, that'll be pretty easy. They're all on the Continental Divide. And they were. So, but yeah, we'd often get the Air Force would call us up, because that's our job for the Air Force. They were getting a locator beacon from these coordinates, or maybe we just got an overdue airplane. So they'd send us up, we'd look around, and sometimes we'd find a crashed airplane. And a few times we'd actually found survivors. Not very often.
The last question that I have for you is the words to the world. This is where I give the guest the last word, and you can promote any idea that you want to. Dale, what are your words to the world?
Well, I go back to what I just said. Impossible to improve what you will not change.
Very good. Well, I leave everybody with, you've given me just enough to talk bad about you later.
Oh, you'll probably get more.
I do appreciate your time here, Dale. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Okay, enjoyed it. Thank you, Buster.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to The Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.